Good morning, Nolan, Bitcoiner. Another episode of The Breakup, a show where we try to contrast the fiat standard and the Bitcoin standard and make predictions about where the world's headed. We definitely try to underline why the world we're coming from has certain irreconcilable or irresolvable problems, and that in a certain sense, there's no point of even solving them because some of this stuff should just be thrown out. Today, we're going to talk about Joe Manchin, and that would be the US dollar in this case. I guess what we're trying to really talk about is that the economy is a psychology engine, and whatever psychological conditions help perpetuate a better future is more or less what humans will decide on. And that's what the show's about. So today we're going to be talking about nuclear energy and The Fourth Turning, a really important book. I mentioned it quite a bit on this show. I mentioned The Sovereign Individual a lot, as you can imagine. These are kind of really important books when it comes to early Bitcoiners and the Bitcoin worldview that early Bitcoiners have helped propagate. So The Fourth Turning is an idea that we shouldn't look at history in terms of a linear path, that it's in fact generational. And by these generations, we can roughly divide them into 20-year periods. So the entire arc is 80 years, and then you put the four generations into each 20-year block, and you basically have a human life and the different generations that that human will encounter during that life. And if you look back in American history, the 80-year blocks line up really accurately with major changes in the country. So right now, 2020 is 2022 now, soon. But that, 80 years before brings us right to World War II. And 80 years before that, we get to the Civil War. 80 years before that, we get to the American Revolutionary War. And you can go into that same system and follow that history, that trajectory right back into British history. I'm not sure how much it lines up with other countries. I've seen it line up pretty well, but I think everyone's on a different path. Historically, it looks like we're all sinking now, but for a long time, the fourth turnings really only applied to America and Anglo-American history. But nevertheless, the generational frame seems useful going forward, and that's why I like to use it. So within these 20-year blocks, I'm going to chart today the history of fiat and contrast it, or even just mention it together with the history of nuclear. And I'm going to put Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia's vote yesterday on the Build Back Better bill, which killed it, $3.5 trillion killed. And I'll show why that might have won World War III for us. So again, in that trajectory of major conflicts and events, I'm arguing that because we're at the end of a fourth turning and at the end of that 80-year block, that we are in fact in another global conflict, another major issue in America that will change the country once we get through it. So let's go back to 1940s. At this point, fiat money ascends. It had been invented long before, but the gold standard remained the measuring stick for everyone's money. So it wasn't relative to each other. What happens in Bretton Woods and the end of World War II is that the US dollar then becomes the relative measuring stick. So all other money is measured relative to the US dollar, which has a fixed exchange rate with gold. So it's borrowing a bit of gold, but it's the US dollar that is the proxy now, that everything is measured by. Nuclear power, of course, was invented to end World War II and then became a major development trajectory afterwards, with lots of nuclear power plants starting to go online and a whole bunch of thinking and futurism and projections about how much nuclear power and free energy was going to change the world. So we say this era began in World War II. It ended with the assassination of JFK and all that trouble that came afterwards. So we tend to think of the early period of a fourth turning, so this is the post-World War II era, as a golden age. What happens next is it begins to unravel. There is a lot of optimism still, but we start to see the fault lines that will become the major issues years later. A similar way of seeing slavery in America happened, where just as the Industrial Revolution was starting and the cotton loom started in America, that's when a lot of the early anti-slavery political groups got formed. Kind of right away when America started, but it continued and ramped up in the 1920s, 1930s, and especially when the American Indian War and um, the war out west with Mexico became an issue, because the winners of that war were going to be able to dictate a lot of slavery policy in the South, and so it was an issue. So it became a political issue yes or no slavery and then turned into a major, the worst, most unbelievable conflict America's ever had, and the most casualties, more than any other war combined, still to this day. So, so in this case, we come to the assassination of JFK, and we find two types of proliferation. So everything's comes about in that 1940s, 1950s period, and then we get to the 60s and 70s. This period ends until Ronald Reagan's second election. So from 63 roughly when Kennedy is killed to 84. And we see two major trends here. Nuclear does proliferate. We see a lot of nuclear power plants straight across Japan, France, several other countries. The United States had quite a few. Fiat proliferation as well. Now that the gold standard was the convertibility of US dollar with gold was fixed in 1971, that went away. So there was no gold anymore either. It was just convertibility with US dollar, and the US dollar took the full role as global benchmark for wealth, the economy, measuring the economy. And US dollar became the most important money in the world by far. And so they proliferated. And it also, because of that, all the early multinational corporations all needed US dollars. And we see the growth of international finance and foreign exchange trading, because really the demand is there for US dollars, not necessarily every other dollar, even though revenues are coming into the other dollar. Most of those companies, let's take Burger King Japan, for example. Burger King Japan getting its revenues in yen, but not really wanting to keep them in yen because that's another type of risk, and they have to manage the issues in the Japanese economy itself, and they're not so sure about that. So of course the demand is there to just go into dollars, and that's what a lot of these companies do, and it grows foreign exchange for that reason. Oil companies, everybody. So that lasts until 1984, but you do have proliferation of both of these things that had sort of come about at the end of World War II. So now they've proliferated. Now we're into the third turning, right, of the four turnings, right, the next 20-year block. And the next 20-year block, we go from about 1984 straight into the financial crisis, 2008. So a little more than 20 years. We've got the fiat moral case, which begins at that point. So we've got central bankers saying they need to rescue Wall Street because it's going to be too bad for the economy for them to go through any trouble. So we start seeing active management, much more than we ever have, of the economy by the Federal Reserve and central bankers, and policies whose effects might be welcomed by most people, but that certainly have consequences. So bailing out stock exchanges, bailing out, well, not so much the stock exchange, but the participants of the stock exchange, the people playing on it, the counterparties, the institutional bankers, all of those folks. When you bail them out, you basically de-risk the system, and you start putting your finger on the balance, which I don't have to prove corruption. I can just say, if these circumstances exist, if now there's this moral case to help folks from the risk which they should have assumed because the things they're doing are risky, trading, if they remove that risk, they're basically making a policy choice to alter the terms of the agreement, and then there's no real counterbalance. So corruption just basically is when you have the private sector not capable of absorbing government power because government power has been shifted to unelected bureaucrats and other folks. You can guarantee there'll be some form of corruption, especially when there are no consequences. I did a video on it the other day explaining, when there are no consequences, you don't really have to prove it. Someone's going to try. So in the third turning here, we get into the moral cases, and the moral case for nuclear against it really takes shape. The Earth Day movement begins in, I guess, the early 70s, and the environmental movement, Silent Spring, late 60s through the 70s, and then really picks up steam in the 80s and 90s. And we start to see nuclear power plants stopped. We start to see Chernobyl. That was a huge black eye for nuclear power because of the effects, right? It's such a terrible meltdown that people couldn't ignore the risks of nuclear power, and the proliferation that was so popular the generation before just stopped, and nuclear power stopped growing at the rate the early people had predicted, and other energy sources then took over. Now, the financial crisis here is this move into the fourth turning where we find ourselves now. So let's just chart the narrative around these two uh, reference points and anything, these two touchstones, fiat and nuclear. Fiat is invented, solves a lot of problems for a lot of people, and wonderful invention at the time. I never want to just dunk on fiat on the show and not say that it wasn't a great invention when it came out. There's no ignoring that. It was clever and also led to more equitable wealth distribution in the world than we had seen in a long time. And by that, I mean metrics like Americans buying homes. You go back to that time in the 1950s, one person working one job could afford a home and have an entire family. And the credit required, a bit of borrowing power from the banks, helped that reality. So whether there's things I like about it and don't like it, I don't understand it all. It's definitely beyond me and most people, but I can see the 1950s economy for some people, not everybody, but for most people was a lot better than it is now. And I think fiat originally had something to do with that. Now the system can be corrupted, and that's what happened. So I'm not arguing to salvage the system at all, but I want to acknowledge an invention when it's real, and it was real back then and it was helpful. So nuclear power, same idea. Fiat is invented, proliferates, then becomes disturbed by policymakers, and then finally we are in the period we're in now, where no one really understands what's going on anymore. There's wealth being generated everywhere, yet people are unemployed. The stock market is way up, yet things are harder to come by. Doesn't look like people can buy houses as easily as they did in the 1950s. It certainly looks like people are priced out of markets everywhere. Even people who have great jobs have a lot of trouble. I know I came out of law school right when this happened. And during the financial crisis, I had a great job, Senate Banking Committee, those typical white collar jobs that people get from all that great education that I had. And I had a lot of trouble keeping up with the system in Toronto because they were printing money and the housing prices were skyrocketing. From the minute I graduated school, prices went up and up and up and up and haven't stopped. The little house that I lived in when I finished law school sold just a few years before I graduated for about $300,000. It sold when I left in 2016 for a little over $1 million, right? Tripling. And now, the 2016, 5 years later, I mean, I'm sure you can get 1.5, maybe 2. I mean, and it was a shitty house, a shitty house. So here's what's going on. And then nuclear power, invented, proliferates, gets mixed up in the politics again. No one really knows what's going on, and then completely shut down. Fukushima, the tsunami in Japan, Japan being a major nuclear powered country after the nuclear meltdown in 2011, so just after the financial crisis, basically mothballed all nuclear power proliferation in the world for a number of years, and there wasn't much going on. So what did Joe Manchin do yesterday? Well, Joe Manchin said, remember, a West Virginian coal mining, the type of people that were telling you in the 2016 election that journalists were saying, learn to code, learn to code. Well, they might just learn nuclear power. So coal not working, right? And Joe Manchin, in the weirdness of the American system, is today finds himself as the most powerful man in the country because you have a divided country, right? We're in the fourth turning. The country is divided right down the middle. You look at the White House press release today about COVID. I mean, pretty nasty stuff. This is what they said. And this is from a government who came in to heal the wounds of the country and no more fighting. They said, vaccinated people, you're going to have a great Merry Christmas. Unvaccinated, death and misery awaits. I mean, that was an actual press release. Now, I get it. They want to get people vaccinated. They have a mandate. I don't really think they want to have Americans having a winter of misery and death or whatever was put in there. But they certainly want to get their political objectives achieved and are using fear and division to do it. So that's what's going on. So we find ourselves in this heavily divided time, but this is what Joe Manchin did. Joe Manchin, a Democrat, so voting with Republicans to kill the Democrat bill, because Joe Manchin is not an idiot. He knows he's the most powerful person in the country now, and people have to come to him. And what he said was, the people of West Virginia want nuclear power. The Build Back Better bill had no provisions for nuclear power, it's more wind and solar and all these other things. And he said, we're not going anywhere unless we have nuclear. So Joe Manchin single-handedly made sure that nuclear didn't have unfair competition subsidized by government as it tries to scale up and proliferate, right? So if nuclear had to compete against subsidized industries in the next few years, it's not so much they're competing in efficiency and generation of power, none of those things. In the end, they're just competing for investment dollars from the government. And if the government is funding all these other things, then nuclear will just get left on the wayside because everyone's taking the free money. Now that there's no free money for these renewable resources like wind and solar, nuclear being a renewable resource as well, the private sector is certainly going to fund one industry that is more efficient. And the private industry that's going to fund it more than any other is Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin wants nuclear reactors. Bitcoin wants to be mined with nuclear reactors because it's the cheapest. Bitcoin miners are going to buy their own portable nuclear reactors and are going to act as if they're a state in that sense. They're going to buy these huge power generation systems that will help perpetuate Bitcoin. And so we see the full circle here. We live in an era of fiat confusion and nuclear shutdown. What's going on with nuclear? Is it dangerous? Is it not? Da, 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 da. So that's our current fourth turning. But Joe Manchin just erased the other side of the energy argument in America. From here on out, it's nuclear. I believe. I believe that was the last chance for anyone to stop the nuclear powered ascension of American energy. And Bitcoin is going to ride that train. And now that we are in this era of fiat confusion, oops, I don't really quite have that lined up. Now we're in this era of fiat confusion. There's a great possibility that if Bitcoin combines with nuclear power and we push into the new first turning, because this is a circle, right? It's the wheel of time, the wheel of fortune, Lady Fortuna. As we head back in here, we might see Bitcoin ascends and new types of nuclear power generation invented, which is where we're already at. Right? We've got Gen 3, Gen 4, theoretical now, but coming online quickly. And we start the wheel over again. So had there never been COVID, had we never had COVID, and we never had something like the Build Back Better bill, we probably would have had a bunch of little legislation here and there. But Joe Manchin, because it was all served to him at once, had the chance to choose nuclear or all this other crap. He chose wisely. And Bitcoin will be able to take that choice and make something out of it that is possibly the real force and momentum and attack vector that's going to help us win World War III and bring everyone back together again with cheap energy and money that works. Are we at the edge of a golden age? I think so. If we're not, tell me. I would love to hear some disagreement. Ciao.